Joan Rivers' decision would ultimately mark the collapse of one of late-night television's most legendary friendships. For years, Johnny Carson and Joan Rivers reigned as late-night royalty, mentor and protege, the king of comedy in his chosen heir. He launched her career, and she made him laugh like no one else could. But in 1986, everything changed. A phone call never came, trust was broken, and a bond was destroyed beyond repair. It was a betrayal Johnny Carson would never forgive, not even until his final days. Welcome back to Legacy News, where today we uncover the untold story behind one of the most heartbreaking rifts in television history. Joan Rivers had been the first permanent guest host of The Tonight Show, personally selected by Carson as his successor. What follows is the account of how their seemingly unbreakable partnership collapsed overnight, leaving behind years of pain, pride, and silence that haunted them both to the grave. You may think you've heard this story before, but what really happened off-camera was more painful than anything the tabloids ever revealed. Misunderstandings, unspoken words, and wounded pride, this is the story NBC never wanted the world to know. And by the end of today's episode, we'll share the emotional letters Joan wrote but never sent, even in her final days. Before diving into the betrayal, it's important to understand just how close Joan and Johnny were. Born Joan Alexander Malinsky in 1933 Brooklyn during the Great Depression to Russian Jewish immigrants, Joan's early life was shaped by financial instability. Her father, a respected doctor, never achieved the financial security the family hoped for, an anxiety that followed Joan throughout her life. "I was always worried about money," she later admitted. "Even when I was doing well, I never trusted it would last." Her parents had traditional dreams. They hoped she would marry a nice Jewish doctor. But Joan had other plans. After graduating from Barnard College with a degree in English literature and anthropology, she took on various jobs, working at an ad agency, as a fashion coordinator, and even as a tour guide at Rockefeller Center, all while dreaming of acting. "I wanted to be Katharine Hepburn," she confessed. "I never thought about being a comedian." But what she couldn't predict was that comedy, not acting, would become her calling, and that the man who would elevate her to stardom would later become the one to cast her aside. In the late 1950s, Joan began performing in clubs under various stage names before settling on Joan Rivers. She took gigs anywhere she could get them: Greenwich Village coffee houses, strip clubs in the Catskills, and rundown bars where audiences barely looked up from their drinks. She often lived on the edge of financial ruin, even sleeping in her car. "I played places so far out in New Jersey that even Jesus couldn't find them," she joked later. What set Joan apart was her tireless work ethic. She kept detailed records of every set, studying which jokes landed and which flopped. Her comedy often drew on her own insecurities, her appearance, failed relationships, and the search for love. "I was dating a football player," she once quipped. "Didn't work out, he couldn't come over, he couldn't fit through the door." At a time when female comedians were expected to be gentle and self-effacing, Joan was raw, bold, and unapologetically honest. This honesty, however, came at a price. Bookers found her too aggressive and unsuitable for mainstream audiences. While male comics could get away with crude humor, Joan was labeled vulgar. Her lowest point came after a failed audition for The Tonight Show, then hosted by Jack Paar, who reportedly told her, "You're not funny. Women aren't supposed to be funny. Go have babies." In the early 1960s, following yet another rejection, Joan sat alone in her car, believing her career was over and contemplating ending her life. What pulled her back was the presence of her loyal dog, Spike, beside her, a reminder that she still mattered to someone. Little did she know that moment of despair would one day be eclipsed by a much deeper heartbreak, the loss of her greatest professional ally and friend, Johnny Carson, after a single decision changed everything. Joan Rivers cherished her unique mix of desperation and dark humor, traits that would ultimately define her signature style. She found laughter in her own suffering, turning painful experiences of rejection and heartbreak into sharp, relatable punchlines that resonated with audiences facing their own battles. Her big break came in 1965 when, as a struggling comedian performing in rough clubs and constantly being turned down, she landed a spot on The Tonight Show. Johnny Carson, already a giant in television, saw something special in this bold, insecure, quick-witted Jewish woman from Brooklyn. After her first appearance, Carson broke tradition by turning to the camera and declaring, "God, you're going to be a star." He meant it, and followed through. He became her champion, inviting her back repeatedly. Their chemistry quickly became a highlight of the show in the 1970s, with Rivers' fiery personality frequently making the normally composed Carson burst into laughter. Their quick-witted exchanges captivated audiences. Joan often credited Carson as the person who discovered her, calling him her mentor and the force behind her rise. Off-screen, their friendship grew stronger. They shared dinners with their spouses, he advised her on career decisions, and even became godfather to her daughter, Melissa. But their bond had its limits. Carson, despite his generous support on air, remained deeply private and emotionally distant in real life. Those close to him described a man who kept others at bay, no matter how close they seemed. Carson was born in Corning, Iowa in 1925 but grew up in Nebraska. His mother Ruth was emotionally cold, a fact Carson would joke about publicly but admitted was deeply hurtful. "She was the toughest son of them all," he once said, adding that there was no affection, not even lap-sitting. That emotional neglect followed him into adulthood, shaping his relationships. While he projected warmth and charm publicly, his private life remained largely inaccessible. Even longtime friends said there was always a wall, a part of Carson that stayed hidden. "Johnny could be with you, but not with you at the same time," said Ed McMahon, his sidekick of 30 years. Carson never fully opened up. His personal relationships often reflected this emotional gap. He married 4 times, with 3 of those marriages ending in divorce. His second wife, Joanne, even filed twice, citing his emotional unavailability. "It's lonely being married to Johnny," she said. "Even when he's home, he's not really there." His professional relationships were similarly volatile. He could warmly embrace performers, only to shut them out over perceived betrayals. Comedian David Brenner, once a favorite, saw his appearances dwindle after he signed a deal with another network, even though the project posed no real threat to Carson. "Johnny's approval was like sunshine," a former Tonight Show writer noted. "It could vanish without warning, and once it did, it was hard to get back into his light." Carson's former lawyer Henry Bushkin later described him as deeply complex, shaped by childhood wounds and broken marriages. Still, despite his issues, by 1983 Carson named Rivers as his permanent guest host, the only one ever to hold that role. It was more than an honor, it was widely interpreted as Carson choosing his eventual successor. Whenever Carson took time off, it was Rivers who filled in, keeping ratings strong and the show on track. Former NBC executive Warren Littlefield said it best, being Johnny's permanent guest host was like being the heir apparent to the comedy throne. For 3 years, everything clicked, viewers loved her, advertisers were happy, and NBC had a solid plan for their crown jewel. Rivers was finally getting the recognition she had worked so long for. Then, everything changed. In early 1986, the newly formed Fox network, backed by Rupert Murdoch, set out to shake up late-night TV. Their bold plan, launch a show in direct competition with The Tonight Show. And who better to lead it than the woman already proving she could host it? Joan, now in her 50s, had built a formidable career, but still lacked lasting security. Her husband Edgar, also her manager, knew how precarious her position was. Carson, now in his 60s, had no intention of stepping down, and NBC wasn't giving Joan any guarantees. In fact, new network president Brandon Tartikoff was rumored to favor younger talent like David Letterman. Joan saw the truth clearly. As Mark Breslin, founder of the Yuck Yucks Comedy Club, put it, she was a middle-aged woman in an industry obsessed with youth. Guest hosting was fine, but there was no future without a plan. Joan was essentially stuck in uncertainty when Barry Diller, chairman of the newly created Fox Broadcasting Company, entered the picture. Rupert Murdoch had assigned Diller the task of establishing Fox as America's 4th major network, and launching a late-night show to rival NBC's Tonight Show was a crucial part of that plan. Fox made Joan an offer she couldn't refuse, her own late-night talk show, not just as a guest host but as the star, with her name in the title, full creative control, and most importantly, job security at age 53, an age when women were often discarded in the industry. The deal reportedly included a staggering $10 million contract, a huge sum in 1986, especially for a female comedian who had fought hard for every chance in her career. For Joan, who had grown up poor and faced financial struggles even at her peak, this security was almost impossible to pass up. Years later, her daughter Melissa Rivers said it wasn't just about the money, it was about finally having a show that truly belonged to her, not just filling someone else's shoes. The initial talks with Fox were kept secret, with Joan and her husband signing non-disclosure agreements, which later made it difficult for her to discuss the offer with Johnny Carson or NBC. But there was a significant issue. Accepting the job meant competing directly against the man who had launched her career, risking being seen as disloyal to Carson, NBC, and The Tonight Show's loyal audience. According to several sources, Joan tried to leverage the Fox offer with NBC through intermediaries, signaling her interest in hearing a counteroffer. However, NBC executives, confident in Carson's star power, made no serious attempt to keep her, essentially calling her bluff. A former NBC executive said their attitude was, if she's got a better offer, she should take it. They misjudged how serious the Fox offer was. Joan later said she agonized over the choice, and Melissa said her mother was torn. She knew the consequences for her relationship with Johnny but couldn't pass up the chance for her own show. Joan believed Johnny would understand, saying, "He's a businessman too." The deal was signed in secret, but before it became public, Joan wanted to tell Johnny personally. This is where a fatal miscommunication occurred. Joan claimed she called Johnny 3 times but he refused to answer. Carson's team told a different story, insisting Joan never made a serious effort, with longtime producer Fred DeCordova stating, "She never called, we have phone logs." Whether Joan truly tried remains unknown. What's clear is Carson learned about Joan's new show the same way the public did, from a Fox press release. For a man with trust issues, this felt like a profound betrayal. His protégé had secretly joined a direct competitor without giving him a heads up. When Joan finally reached Johnny by phone after the news broke, the brief conversation was cold. She said he told her, "You didn't call me, and it's too late now," then hung up. He never spoke to her again. The fallout was immediate and harsh. Carson, who rarely showed emotion publicly, made his feelings obvious through actions. Joan's name was banned from The Tonight Show, her photos removed, and her comedy albums pulled from rotation, as if NBC wanted to erase her completely. Carson addressed it once on air, stating, "Joan Rivers will not be back on this show. I felt betrayed. That's it. It's over," receiving applause. Behind the scenes, he made it clear, anyone who worked with Joan wouldn't work with him. In television, no one chose Joan over Johnny. Almost overnight, Joan went from comedy royalty to industry outcast. Famous friends stopped calling, invitations dried up, Vegas bookings vanished. It wasn't just Carson who shut her out, it was the entire industry, afraid to cross its biggest star. The Late Show starring Joan Rivers premiered on October 9, 1986, with much fanfare. The set was glamorous, featuring Joan's personal touches and a lavish Art Deco desk. Opening night included guests like Cher, David Lee Roth, and Pee Wee Herman, though many A-listers declined, signaling the industry's loyalty to Carson. Joan opened the show with a monologue addressing the unavoidable topic. "I couldn't wait because I was getting older, and so were Johnny's guests. I was thrilled to be back, working at night where I felt I belonged." The Los Angeles Times praised the debut as impressive, and the initial ratings looked promising, especially for the new Fox network. However, trouble began behind the scenes from the start. Though Fox executives appreciated the publicity around their new late-night show, they soon grew anxious about directly competing with Carson's program. Network President Barry Dillard and Chairman Rupert Murdoch had hired Joan Rivers for her sharp, acerbic comedic style but quickly got cold feet about letting her be herself. According to Frank Conniff, one of the show's writers, notes arrived immediately, urging Joan to be softer and less abrasive. They wanted her to tone down her famous "Can we talk" catchphrase, which was like asking Johnny not to swing his golf club. Fox assigned various executives to oversee the show, undermining Joan's creative control. Booking guests was especially difficult because many A-list celebrities avoided The Late Show, fearing backlash from Carson. When Fox secured notable guests, executives often overruled Joan's interviewing style, demanding she be less probing and more flattering. They wanted her to appear warm and non-threatening, very different from the brutally honest Joan Rivers who built her career on sharp honesty, as a former producer who wished to remain anonymous explained. Joan's husband and executive producer, Edgar Rosenberg, increasingly clashed with Fox management. Despite negotiating what they believed was significant creative control, the Rosenbergs were shocked by the network's heavy interference. Edgar fought hard to protect Joan's vision while handling executives who seemed to regret hiring her. By early 1987, the strain showed on air. Joan, usually a consummate professional, sometimes appeared flustered or annoyed during tapings. Ratings began to fall as the show struggled to find a consistent identity amid conflicting directions. Behind the scenes, Fox executives were already plotting to destroy not just Joan's show but her entire life as she knew it. The Late Show starring Joan Rivers was beset by problems from the beginning. Fox constantly pushed Joan to soften her sharp style and be more likable, essentially asking her to give up what made her successful. Ratings were poor, critics harsh, and just 7 months after the premiere, Fox fired Joan in May 1987. In a cruel move, they informed Edgar first, undermining Joan's authority by having him deliver the news. Years later, Melissa Rivers said, "Can you imagine putting a husband in that position? It was humiliating for both." The personal toll was devastating. Amid this professional crisis, Edgar fell into a deep depression after also being fired. He had managed Joan's career for decades and negotiated the Fox deal that was meant to secure their future, but now he was blamed for its failure. The phone call Joan dreaded finally came. On August 14, 1987, Edgar checked into a Philadelphia hotel room and took a lethal dose of prescription drugs. He left notes, including one to Joan that said, in part, "I love you and Melissa more than life itself, but I can't go on." Joan was filming a small role in London when she got the heartbreaking news, and her 19-year-old daughter Melissa had to identify her father's body. Within 1 year, Joan had lost her mentor, her show, and her husband of 22 years, a crushing series of blows that would have broken most people. "It was the darkest period imaginable," she later said. "I lost everything, my career was in ruins, Edgar was gone, and I was suddenly a widow with a teenage daughter to support and $37 million in debt because of bad investments and the failed Fox deal." What made it worse was Johnny Carson's continued silence despite their long friendship and professional history. Knowing of Edgar's death and Joan's devastation, he never reached out. Joan said in a 2012 interview, "When Edgar died, I thought Johnny would call. Over the years, I'd send him birthday wishes, Christmas gifts, congratulations on his children's births. I really thought he'd reach out when Edgar died. That's when I realized it was really over between us." True to his word, Carson never spoke to Joan again and made sure she remained banned from The Tonight Show for the rest of his tenure, which ended in 1992. This led to one of television's longest acts of professional exclusion and showed Carson's lasting influence. The ban continued even after Jay Leno took over, reportedly out of respect for Carson's wishes. For 26 years, Joan Rivers was barred from the very show that made her a star. The ban was only lifted when Jimmy Fallon became host in 2014, finally welcoming Joan back just months before her death. Joan described her return as like being allowed to come home after being banished from the kingdom. "I never thought I'd see that stage again." This feud was about much more than a job offer or competition. It cut deeply because it touched the core of who these two comedy legends truly were. For Johnny Carson, loyalty was paramount. Raised in Depression-era Nebraska by an emotionally distant mother, he developed a lifelong habit of keeping others at arm's length while demanding absolute loyalty from the few he allowed close. His childhood taught him that emotional attachments were risky, yet he longed for connection, a contradiction that shaped his personal and professional relationships. Hollywood Whispers revealed a harsher side of Carson's need for control, with stories of quietly sidelining those who crossed him and making discreet calls to network executives that could end careers overnight. By 1986, he was more than a TV host, he was television's ultimate gatekeeper. After 3 failed marriages, his trust issues deepened. When the Joan Rivers conflict emerged, Carson viewed betrayal not just as disappointing but as proof of his deepest fears about human bonds. Joan Rivers, on the other hand, came from a very different background. Born Joan Alexandra Malinsky to Russian Jewish immigrant parents, she grew up in a culture that prized survival and opportunity above all. Her early career was filled with rejection and hardship. Even after achieving success, she lived with the constant fear common among comedians, especially women, that her career could vanish overnight. Rivers often said, "Nobody was going to take care of me but me," reflecting the brutal reality that in comedy, you're only as good as your last joke. To understand her choice to accept the Fox offer, it's crucial to see the context of her career. Despite her success as Carson's guest host, she had no guaranteed future at NBC. Carson, then in his early 60s, showed no intention of retiring soon, and NBC gave no assurance about succession. Television was notoriously unkind to aging women, with few opportunities for women in their 50s to lead their own shows, as comedy historian Cliff Nederoff noted. Joan viewed the Fox offer not just as a chance but potentially her last opportunity. Many now interpret the feud through the lens of gender politics. Was Joan held to a different loyalty standard than her male peers? When David Letterman left NBC for CBS in 1993 after being passed over for The Tonight Show, he faced far less backlash than Rivers. Comedy historian Yael Cohen argued there was a clear double standard: men were expected to be ambitious and strategic, women to be grateful and loyal. Joan broke that unspoken rule and paid for it for the rest of her life. What makes this story so tragic is that both Carson and Rivers acted from deeply ingrained values and fears. Johnny demanded loyalty above all else, while Joan sought to secure her future in an industry that discarded women once past their prime. Neither was entirely right or wrong, and neither could fully understand the other's perspective. The Tonight Show ban outlasted Carson by almost a decade, finally lifted when Jimmy Fallon took over in February 2014. On March 27, 2014, at age 80, Joan Rivers returned to The Tonight Show stage for the first time since 1986, briefly appearing during Fallon's monologue. The moment was symbolically powerful. "It's about time," Joan quipped to thunderous applause. 5 months later, Rivers died from complications after a routine throat procedure. The overwhelming grief and tributes underscored how fully she had rebuilt her image and career since the feud. After her death, her daughter Melissa discovered decades of unsent letters Joan had written to Carson, letters of apology, explanation, and gratitude she never sent, knowing they'd likely go unanswered. Melissa revealed her mother never stopped hoping for reconciliation and kept a photo of them together in her office until her death. In her final autobiography, Joan wrote, "The saddest thing in the world is that Johnny Carson and I never made peace. I still feel empty about it." Howard Stern, in his eulogy, perhaps captured their parallel lives best. Johnny had the throne, but Joan had to fight for every bit of respect until her last day. In the end, she created a legacy uniquely her own. In life and death, Rivers and Carson remained divided by the misunderstanding and hurt that began in 1986. Two comedy giants who once brought each other joy ended their lives unable to bridge the gap caused by ambition, miscommunication, and pride. Their story exemplifies the complex reality of show business friendships, built on mutual benefit but vulnerable to relentless industry pressures. Both were pioneers who reshaped television comedy, yet even they couldn't overcome the pain that separated them. Now, we want to hear your thoughts. Was Joan right to accept the Fox offer to protect her future, or did she betray the man who launched her career? Was Carson's harsh reaction justified or excessively cruel? Share your views below to enrich our community discussion. If you enjoyed this deep dive into TV history, please like and subscribe to Legacy News for more authentic, well-researched stories behind the headlines. No exaggerations or made-up drama, just the fascinating truths about the stars you love. Let us know which famous Hollywood relationships or feuds you'd like us to explore next, from Betty Davis and Joan Crawford to the infamous Sinatra-Luford fallout. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time with another captivating story.